Hi, I'm Libby Cornish from Decadent Alternatives. In this video, I'm going to discuss feeding Arthur, my sourdough culture. And if you've bought the goodie bag, you'll be getting a little bit of Arthur as well. So basically, sourdough cultures are a mixture of yeast and bacterial species. Normally, it's a wild type of baker's yeast or brewer's yeast. And normally the bacterial species are usually lactobacillus. So these beasties or bacteria and yeast all live on glucose. Now, in wheat-based sourdough cultures, there's a enzyme in wheat flour, amylase, that actually breaks starch down into sugar. So for yeast or for sourdough cultures that are growing on wheat or in particular rye, there is a readily available food source for the yeast. Now, lactobacillus bacteria actually produce their own amylase and can break down starches into sugars. So they have their own little food source if there's not enough amylase available in the wheat flour. When it comes to Baker's Magic flour, the bacteria, the lactobacillus, will be able to break down some of the starch into sugar, and they'll have an energy source for themselves. But most of they won't actually be that much for the yeast. So we actually do need to add in an energy source for the yeast. So when I feed Arthur, and say I've got 200 grams of Arthur, I will use 150 grams to make a loaf of bread instead of my 2 teaspoons of yeast in 100 grams of water with 10 to 15 grams of sugar. I'm using 150 grams of my sourdough culture. I then take that 50 grams of Arthur and I add to it 50 grams of flour, 100 grams of water, and a sugar sauce. When I say sugar sauce, that sugar sauce could be just as simple as table sugar, or it could be glucose powder, it could be rice malt syrup, it could be sultanas or honey or maple syrup or roasted pumpkin or roasted sweet potato, as long as there is actually a sugar source that the yeast can live off. So basically, the yeast will use the glucose to divide and produce and ferment. So they will actually produce carbon dioxide, and that's where you get your lift in your bread. And the lactobacillus, lactic acid bacteria, will produce lactic acid, and that's usually the sour flavor in your bread. Depending upon how long the cultures have been sitting and brewing, you can change the flavor. So if you have a higher sugar bread, you are going to give your yeast and your lactic acid a readily available food source, and your yeast will be able to multiply or produce carbon dioxide a lot quicker than they normally would if you don't have as much in there. So for that, you can actually change the flavor of the bread. When I did another little video on feeding Arthur. That was yesterday. I fed him at 3:00 and I had 4 jars of 250 grams of Arthur. One I put outside, which would have been about 5 or 6 degrees. The other I had on my kitchen bench, which may have been, it was a cold day yesterday, it may have been 15 degrees. Might have even got up to 17 degrees where he was. Then I had one in under our firebox, and it's a very, very nicely toasty, warm place there, which probably was between maybe 26 and 30. And then I put Arthur in hot water. After I did that video, I then just put all of the vials of, or all of the bottles of Arthur outside and left them overnight. I have now taken them and brought them in here to show you. So it's nearly 26 hours after feeding him. And this is the one that was just outside. Or if you can see basically that there is only a few little bubbles coming up basically from growing. So he hasn't actually really grown yet. This would be what you'd expect to see if you were basically feeding Arthur and then putting it in the fridge. This one, the next one is the one that I did in the kitchen. And you can see that there's quite a little bit of growth for Arthur. He started fermenting. So basically, it's if he was warm enough and then went outside, there was enough to keep him growing. The next one is the firebox. And I actually, the firebox and the one that was in the hot water, I shook the culture down and then let it grow again. And so that is growth from underneath the firebox. You can see lovely, all those gas pockets. And then the water one, I hadn't actually quite killed him, but you can see it. Again, there's a lot of carbon dioxide production. So the ones that, all of them apart from the one that was just straight outside, are ready to use. I could actually take 150 grams of each of those and make a couple of loaves of bread. The one that was at 4 degrees, so the one showing minimal activity, I would put Arthur in I'd warm him up a little bit, and then I'd actually use him to make a loaf of bread. Now, what it means is that if you are making your bread and you want to do it in the fridge overnight, if you haven't given warmth to or made a warm mix to start off with, it's going to take a lot longer to actually get the bread to prove. So for that would have been, if that was straight bread, putting it into the fridge, and it would take, nearly 48 hours to actually get a decent loaf of bread. So if you are going to make a loaf and you want to do it overnight, then ensure that you put it at, say, 30 degrees or even as high as 37 degrees first for, say, maybe an hour and a half, and then put it into the fridge overnight. Thank you.